Okay, let's start for the second part. We are going to build a model that is a little bit more complex than what we've done so far. It's going to be a model that is involving two populations, but also tracking the epidemic status of individuals in these populations. It's inspired by an actual biological case study, which is the sharing of different pathogens between the gray squirrel and red squirrel, and notably the fact that the gray squirrel can transmit the parapox virus to red squirrels, and red squirrels do not recover from the infection. They end up dying from the infection over time, and that is accelerating the competitive exclusion by the of the red squirrel by the gray one. So we're not going to go through the precise parameterization of the models. We're going to find some parameter values that gives an interesting results, and then we are going to go a little bit into how we build a model, how we add some density dependence into the demography, and then how we can extract information to bring this into ecological grounds, and what the fact that sharing pathogens can mean for ecological dynamics. So it is going to be a big and somewhat impressive model. So don't worry. We'll go through adding the reactions one at a time. So let's call that Squirrel model, and it is a reaction network that begins. So what we want to do is first, just so we can check what we're going to do, is define a simple model that is going to look a lot like the logistic model. So it's going to be a model for susceptible gray squirrel. I'm going to start with a gray. And they are going to die at a rate of mu. So that's the first thing that we have in our network, right? It's a single compartment, and we will let's look at the graph. And of course, we need to define the rate of mortality. So we have an initial population, and there is an arrow that goes outside, and so at a given rate, which is mu, individuals are going to get removed from this population. So the next thing we want to do is add the capacity for this population to grow. So we can do that. So question from the chat, does susceptible squirrel die even if they're not infected? Yes, there's natural demography, and after some time they get very, very old. And they die. There's a lot of squirrels who are going to be, a lot of virtual squirrels are going to die during this exercise. Just a heads up. We could give a growth rate, R, and say that at this given growth rate, they are going to reproduce. It's a choice that we can make. Let's run that. Let's add the parameter. Let's run that. And run that. Okay, so now we have a feedback loop that is birth, and then we have another feedback loop here, which is death. So we could simulate that and say, well, if mu and r are equal, it is going to, the population is going to remain at equilibrium. But that's not necessarily what we want to do. We'd like to do something a little bit more involved, where there is going to be some density dependence. So if there's a lot of individuals already, we expect that the birth rate, the growth rate of the population is going to decrease. That is, the population regulating itself. If it's a small population, it's going to grow very fast. If it's a large population, it's not going to grow a lot because of lack of resources. So what we'll do, just to show what that looks like, is that we are going to add another population, which is going to be red squirrels. And now we can check that our model has two compartments. It has a susceptible red and a susceptible gray, and they all behave in the same way. They have the same rate. We're assuming that the demographic parameters for both species are equal. Not a big assumption, but it's an assumption that we are going to do nonetheless. Now, what do we say? Like, well, I want R to be decreasing if there's a lot of individuals. What we can say is it's going to be R times 1 minus, let's do SR plus SG over K, right? And we are going to use that here. So what that means is the actual rate that we're going to use for the calculation is not going to be R all the time. That when the sum of both populations are going to be reaching K, that is going to be 0, right? There's going to be some mortality, it's going to bring it under the carrying capacity, so it's going to be not 0 for a while, and so there's going to be an equilibrium, which is going to be around K. It's not going to be exactly K, it's going to be a little lower. You can work it out on paper if you want. It takes like half a minute. And when we assume that mu gets closer and closer to 0, then the equilibrium value gets closer and closer to K. So K is the number of individuals for which there is no more room for squirrels in the population. That's a model parameter as well. So we define the model here, and we can look at the graph. And it gets slightly more complicated, right? Because we have a new arrow that we hadn't seen before, which is an inhibition. The inhibition that we have specifically is that this reaction here, by which one susceptible red squirrel produces two susceptible red squirrel, that is natality. It's going to be negatively impacted by the number of red squirrel and the number of gray squirrels. And same thing for the natality of gray squirrels. So what we have built here is a competition model with a very strong assumption. The very strong assumption that we've made is that the rate of competition are equal. So let's try that. We can try this. We can try that. Let's go like squirrel, no infection. Do squirrel, no infection here. I'm just going to get that because that's what we want. Say that. So we're going to transform that into an EDU problem. We want the one that is squirrel, no infection. We are going to start with 200 and then 100. Oh, let's check the order of things. So the first species is the gray squirrel, and the second species is the red one. And the red one is at a competitive disadvantage. But anyway, in real life, not in the model, at least not yet. We need a T-span. I'm going to do 0 to, I don't know, 500. And then we need to set some parameters for the model. And we need to set parameters that are in order, mu, r, and k. So mu is a rate of mortality. So one way to think about that is how long does it take for an individual to die on average. So we're going to say that these species that we're using, which are not necessarily, I don't know how long squirrels live. But I think I tried with a value of, let me check, 10 years. So mu is going to be 1 over 120. We're going to use months again. R is how long does it take to create a new generation, or you can sometimes see it as what is the number of months during which an individual is able to reproduce, what is the average like production period across the lifetime of an individual. We are going to put that to 24, like every 2 years is going to be a new generation in our population. And K is going to be 2000. So these are the parameters. We are going to put them in a vector of parameters, mu, r, and k. And we can run the model. I think we have loaded differential equations, so we don't need to specify the solver that we want to use. That is defined, we can solve it, and then we are going to plot that. So at this time, what we should see, let's think about the results a little bit. The growth rate is the same. There is no difference between intra and inter-specific competition. And so we would expect what is called like neutral coexistence. The population are going to occupy the carrying capacity at a proportion that is the same as the proportion they had initially. So there should be about twice as much, there should actually be exactly twice as much individual from the first species than there are individual from the second species, which is what we see here. So there's like a bit more than 500 here and a bit more than 1,000 here. We can check at the last element of the solution. That is exactly twice as much. That makes sense, right? We don't have any competition here. And so because we don't have any competition, they're just going to grow at the same rate until they occupy the same proportion of the carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity they seem to be reaching is 1,599-ish. That is because there is a rate of mortality, and so they're not reaching the full 2000. So they're never quite reaching the point where they stop growing entirely. There's still some demographic turnover in this population, which is going to be important because that turnover is creating new susceptible individuals. So that's good. It tracks with what we expect in this model. Let's add infection. So if you want to add infection, we need to add a lot of different combination of things, because we are going to need to add at least 2 compartments. The first is going to be beta, that is the rate of infection, and it's going to transform an infected gray squirrel plus a susceptible gray squirrel into 2 infected gray squirrel. And then we do the same thing for the red squirrels. Going to call that beta here. Run this model and have a look at the graph. So the graph is getting more complex. There's still density dependence across the natality rate, but there is also this new compartment where individual can move from being susceptible to being infectious. What there is not here is the fact that a gray squirrel who is infectious can also infect a red squirrel who is susceptible. So there is no cross-species transmission, which is the next thing that we need to build. And we're going to make a huge simplification by saying that it's actually happening at the same rate. We can change that later if we want. But we need to add two reactions. The first one is what if a gray squirrel who is infectious is infecting a red squirrel who is susceptible? And then it's the other way around, obviously. So now we have something where it starts like maybe, you know, we can start thinking maybe the graph is not going to be very useful because the model is getting more and more complex because there's a lot more interactions all over. And that's correct. The graph is going to become less and less useful over time because we are adding a number of things. But let's keep building that. We're going to add a red called gamma, and gamma is going to be the recovery of the different species. So we see that the gray squirrel are going to, which one did I use? Yeah, the gray one are going to recover at a red called gamma. What else do we need? Oh, we need the fact that the red squirrel do not recover from the infection. They die at a red that we'll call mu. So they're going to go into the empty set. So let's run that again. And we're still missing a couple things. We're still missing most interesting things, actually. So the model is getting more and more complex, but what we see is that the infectious red squirrels are now dying, and the gray squirrel are now recovering. Let's assume that they also lose their immunity over time. We need to add kappa as a variable. And now we have this huge mess of a network. So we can still go into like checking that the reactions are correctly implemented, but it's not necessarily getting more useful. We need to do a few more things. And the things we need to do is that we need to add mortality for all of the species. So because the rate of mortality, we're going to assume that it happens regardless of the fact that you are infected or not. So there's the fact that you have been sick before has no impact on your future mortality. Let's run the model again. Let's look at the graph. We have arrows that are leaving every compartment, so that's good. There's two arrows that are leaving the red squirrel infectious compartment. And that's because we have the natural mortality and we have the disease mortality. So that is important. The next thing that we need to specify is who is contributing to reproduction, right? And so in order to make sure that everyone is contributing to reproduction, we need to define a couple of things. We need to define how many individual count towards the carrying capacity, and that's obviously going to be all of the population. So it's plus I R plus I G plus RG. Let's do that. Let's look at the graph, and now everyone is affecting the reproduction reactions. Don't worry, it's going to get much worse in a minute. What else do we got? So the next thing that we have, that we can keep this reaction here and say, well, an infectious individual is going to reproduce, and it's going to give a susceptible individual from the same species. It's going to be IG, IG plus SG, and then finally a removed individual is going to get a removed individual plus a susceptible one. Now let's look at the graph. All right, yes, that is the good stuff. That is typically the point where you stop looking at the graph, and you might want to check that the equation makes sense. So the equation are also going to be, they're going to be fairly big. The system Squirrel. but at least you can read them. You can check that everything makes sense, and it's sort of, you can copy and paste that, and you'll see there's a lot of terms because of this thing that should actually be n, but overall, this is what the model is going to look like, and it's not that complex. I mean, if you look at the textbook version of this model that is omitting one compartment, it's going to look a little bit like this. It has 6 compartments. It has 7 variables. It's all good. It is what it is. We can make that a lot more complicated. Like, we can make that a lot more complicated, and we actually might, depending on how much time we spend actually running this thing. So we need to set a number of parameters here. Before we do that, let me explain something. Writing this is the same thing as writing down the system of equations. The advantage here is that you are writing every compartment, every single process that happens in your model as a single line, which you can document extensively. And after that, it is going to tell you what the equation is. I think it's not to be underestimated, the fact that you can actually write the code and then have the code be the math. That's something that I've found quite amazing. Let me move this one here. We'll do a couple things. We'll do a few comments. So this is natural mortality. This is density, dependent growth. This is infection, including cross-species. This is recovery. This is mortality through disease. And that is background mortality, which we're going to put here. IG. So it's susceptible, infectious, removed. Mortality through disease. And then we are going to have loss of immunity over time. Okay, so I actually really like writing models this way because you can list what the different behaviors, what the different processes that you want to put into your models are, and check that it's complete. Let's have a look at the parameters of this model. So it's mu, r, k, beta, gamma, nu, kappa. And let's have a look at the species. And the species are SG, SR, IG, IR, RG. Okay. So, parameters. We're going to bring in some of the parameters from before. So what do we need to define? We have mu, we have r, we have k, we have beta. It's going to be 5, yeah, something like that. We'll set it later. Gamma is 1 over the duration of immunity, which I put at 3. Yeah, why not? What do we have next? We have nu, which is the mortality, and I set that as something that I forgot to write down. Anyway, we're going to say that it's like a 6 months life expectancy when you're infected by that disease, and then kappa is the duration of immunity, which we're going to put at a year. So average life expectancy 10 years. Generation time 2 years, maximum 2,000 individuals, rate of transmission, rate of development of immunity for the species that can develop immunity, rate of mortality, and then rate of recovery. So we can do P equal mu R K beta gamma mu and kappa. Right. So the initial population size we're going to set are like 200, 100. We're going to say like 0 infected individual here, 10 here, and 0 recovered. And then we can start running our little thing. So we change the model. It's Squirrel now, keep the same time span. We solve that. And then we look at the solution. So the model we specified is it's very complex, right? It has it goes for 31 to 50. It has about 20 different reactions. It is a dense network. Every single arrow here is like a term multiplied by another term. There's a lot of interactions. You're doing that at the moment, but imagine that you would have to think about the Jacobian matrix of this system. That would be the stuff of nightmare. But not really. There's ways to do that. It's not. It's bad, but it's not that bad. But solving that is almost instantaneous, right? So we could do a lot of simulations. We could do a lot of different conditions and see what's happening. So what is happening here? So remember that what we had in the first model with no infection, which by the way we can still get here, right? We just say no infectious individual. It's a good check of the model. If there's no infectious individual, the population should grow according to the first model. And that is indeed what we find. So if we put some individuals infected, the population should grow in a much different way because there is no an epidemic that is shared by both of these species. So what is going on here? So remember that in the first simulation, we went from this susceptible gray population that was at about 1,000 individuals, and then the susceptible red population was about 500. What we see here is a much different behavior because the SR population is now extinct. There are no more individuals left in this population. So looking at more than 3 curves is usually confusing, so we can like extract them a little bit. We're going to do 2 things. We're going to increase the time span from 0 to 50 years. That shouldn't work. Okay. Let's cut it when it's actually stabilizing. What we want to do is sort of think about this model in an ecological way, right? And we don't necessarily want to have all of these different behaviors like that. So exploratory data analysis. We're going to make a first plot that is going to be what is the total population size? That's like quite simple, and it's sol t. And it's going to be the sum of the solution seems equal to, and that probably needs to be as a vector. Oh, it's definitely not that. No, that. Yes. So that is the total population size. Like both species they go from 300 individual to about the same carrying capacity that we had in the previous model, right? So we had something that was about close to 1600. That is all of the species at once. Not necessarily really, sorry, both species, not necessarily what we care about, right? Both species. Another thing we can do is look at the population size for the first species. So it's going to be 1 and then 3. I think it's, sorry, let me check what the species are. S, G, I, G, and R, G. So it's a gray one. 1, 3, and 5. So that is species number, let's call them gray, that's species number 1. And then the second population is 2 and 4. So what we see now is that before we had a growth of both species, at some point here, what we see is a decline in the population size of the red species. And the reason they're declining is because there is this infection going on. So we can also try to plot like what is the number of infectious individual, total number of infectious individual over time. So it's a solution of 1, no sorry, it's 3 and 4. And that is the number of infectious individual, right? So it's total infectious. Underneath that, we can see, we can have a look at how much species is contributing to that. So 3 is going to be, 3 is gray. And 4 is red. And so what we see that initially the two epidemics are peaking at the same time in the population. But one of the population is able to recover. There is a possibility for the development of immunity after infection, and so it sort of like catches up, and there's still some infectious people here because immunity is lost and because the new individuals are susceptible. The other population that gets infected is going to die because there is no way for these individuals to recover from the infection. And so the infection process here is disrupting the balance of growth and density dependence between this population in such a way that whereas previously they were coexisting, no, they are not, and one of the species has excluded the other, not through direct competition, but through indirect competition that involves the pathogen. There's a few different things we can do. There's something that is that's interesting, maybe to look at, is what is the proportion of infection of individual from this red species that are coming from themselves versus from the other species. So it's going to be beta, which we have set as a parameter, times what? Times the number of infectious gray individual, which is 3, divided by, we don't need that, divided by the total number of infectious individual, right? We need to add a t here. Sol.t, and then that. So like out of the total force of infection here, over time, during the first 100 time steps, less and less is due to the proportion of individuals that are contributing infection from the gray population is about 1/2. If we remove beta, it's actually easier to see, and we want y-lim to be 0 to 1. So at the beginning, we have set the initial cases to come from the beta, the gray species. So they are 100% of all cases, and then as that progresses, they get closer to about half, and then that's increasing again. So what is happening here is that is a point where red individuals start decreasing in abundance because of the mortality that's due to the disease. I think that's an interesting exercise to show that a simple model of competition can also get expanded by adding some epidemics into it, and that has real ecological consequences. So I've mentioned a bit that we were doing some simplifications here. There are a number of complexities that we can add. Two of them are fairly obvious. Assumption number one that we have made is equal rates of cross-species transmission. So let's say, for example, it doesn't matter which two individuals come into contact, right? If it's gray and red, or red and red, it's going to be the same rate of infection. But maybe we can say, maybe the species tend to keep together a little bit. And so overall, a contact between two gray or two red individual is more likely than a contact between individuals from different species. So we can say that it's like, I don't know, let's say like 80% as likely. No, that's not this one, it's the one underneath. Okay, so the intraspecific infection is going to be 100%, and the interspecific infection is going to be 80% of that. That might not necessarily change the entire model. That's still the same awful graph that we had before, and then we can rerun the simulation. And it should have a small effect. So a small effect that it should have is that it should maybe decrease a little bit the speed at which the species are removed. And it's changing the dynamic ever so slightly. That is the first simplification we can make, and that the first simplification that we can decide to remove is that instead of having a single parameter, we can have a matrix of parameters. And so here's the diagonal elements would be beta, and the off-diagonal elements would be 8/10 of beta. The next big assumption we're making is that there is no structure of competition in this model. Intraspecific competition and interspecific competition are going to be equal. And as you're working on the second project at the moment, which involves a Lotka-Volterra competitive model, you know that it's not necessarily the case. There is always going to be the coexistence, the structure of coexistence in this type of model will depend very strongly on the fact that we can have some coexistence or some competitive exclusion. And we could also decide to put that here. We could add mechanisms that would favor coexistence between species. So let's say that we want intraspecific competition to be larger than interspecific competition. What that means that if you are restricting new cells more than you are restricting others, that should lead to coexistence. So that is SG, and so everything that has a G in it is going to be a little bit more competitive. Let's copy that. Here it is SR, and so everything that has an R in it, more competitive. G, These are also things that we could set as parameters, right? We don't need to write 1.1 or like 0.8. We could definitely be adding that as parameters and change the shape of the matrix and all that. So the model is going to be exactly as complicated as we want to make it. And it's already slightly past the point where I'm happy with it. Okay, so let's run this. Still the same graph. We hadn't changed the reaction of our model, but now we had a little bit more intra-specific competition. So there should be more coexistence. More coexistence leads to higher population size. Higher population size in turn leads to easier transmission of the disease, and we can see that it's changing the dynamic. Not to the point where we are reversing the results and one of the species is surviving, but still to the point where it's not quantitatively the same thing. Are there other simplifications we've made? Yes, there's plenty. We've assumed that the rate of mortality is the same for both species. We've assumed that the growth rate is also the same for both species. What if the red squirrel was growing a little bit faster? We can do that by setting it to, say, 1.2 here. And so the model that we can, I'm not going to show the graph, I'm sick of it. We can tweak the behavior of the model to remove some of the simplification that we've been making. We've also, and what is interesting is that because the simulation are so fast, we can change the parameters and then look very rapidly at the different results, right? So is it changing the behavior of the model? No. Is it still going to go extinct? But it's changing the dynamics. It's changing a little bit what happened at the peak of the epidemic. So red is growing much faster. It's accumulating infections much faster as well. So that's a good example of a model that we can start very simple, like a model of logistic growth of a single population. And then we can expand step by step, go like outwards in the process. We add a second population and they get some density dependence. And then there's an infection that happens. And so we add the process of infection that can go within species, but also across species. And then the two species respond differently to infection. One of them dies, one of them recovers, but eventually lose its immunity over time. And then we can go into the fine detail of these parameters to say maybe the rates are not equal, maybe there's competition in a specific way, maybe there's some different growth rate, maybe there's different lifespan, maybe one of the species is short-lived, the other is long-lived. So there's a lot of tweaks we can do. Usually, it's a good idea to question like which one is important, which one do I really care about from a mechanistic point of view, which mechanism do I want to put into my model so much that I'm willing to expand the cost and effort of additional parameters and more code that I need to maintain and to write and to debug eventually to make sure that the model is working. So this module was an exercise in bringing things a little over the top in terms of complexity. But in some situations, it's worth it to go into the details of what the very fine changes of values in the parameters can do. A common example with this type of models is the spread of foot and mouth disease in farms, where cattle and sheep are very different reactions to the disease, and so their relative epidemics over time is peaking at different times, at different intensity. They also have different population size, things like that, and so it is going to be a much more realistic model in that case to invest the extra refinement in the parameters when we're just interested in epidemics as a process that we want to understand what happens when there's competition. Can epidemic change the outcome of a competitive process? Then maybe we don't need all of these changes. So what is important here is that every rate here can be modified, right? But our initial model has a small number of parameters, which I think is more than enough, and we can tweak them if we want. But most of the time, and especially for the project that you'll have to do, it's better to not guess and assume that things are going to be mostly homogeneous. If it's not, I'll let you know in the instruction for the project. So that is going to conclude the second module on simulating epidemics. Next week we are going to try and make a small transition into the final module of the class, which is coupling models to data. And we are going to look at a dataset of flu infection in a boarding school in the UK, which is, it's very interesting to work with because it has it fits nicely with an SIR model, and so we can start thinking about what are the parameters, what do they mean, how do we figure out what the value of the parameters should be, and how good is the best guess that we can make on the model compared to the dataset. It's an interesting exercise, and it's going to let us move into from the domain of purely theoretical models into models that have some grounding in empirical data set. And so I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.